So in this video, we're actually going to create the myInteger object based on the myInteger class that we just created. We're actually probably going to do this a couple of times just to demonstrate a couple of different concepts here. So first, let's create a new integer object. You guys can already tell that I'm having a really hard time talking and typing. Alright, there we go. So that creates our new myInteger object, and we set its value to 6172. Now, obviously, this is our type. We've seen this plenty of times before. It's just, in this case, it is our object type, similar to scanner and ArrayList. We have our variable name being integer object. We obviously set it equal to something. This is still general format of creating variables in Java. We have new. We've talked about new a little bit. New is what works in tandem with your constructor that you create in your class, or was created in another class that was created by somebody else, that says, I want to make a new instance. I want to create a new object of this type. And then, of course, the next thing that you do is you call the constructor. Now, this is actually the constructor that we created in the previous video for myInteger. And we can see that we actually provide it with the int parameter that we were supposed to. In this case, we provide it with 6172 for obvious reasons, I guess. But now let's perform some actions on our class. Do some behaviors. In this case, it'll be a very similar setup to what we did with scanner and ArrayList. You guys will see that a lot of this will be very similar, and that's because it is. A lot of how you interact with objects is done in the exact same way. What usually changes is the characteristics and what options are available to you for behaviors between objects. Like, obviously, scanner has next int, but ArrayList doesn't, because there would be no reason to. What would next int do for ArrayList? There is no. That's not helpful. That's not specific to the task that ArrayList is trying to accomplish. And it's the same sort of idea with myInteger, is that we are trying to meet a specific need, and we need to fit that need and make sure that we have the methods available to us, the behaviors and the characteristics that actually meet that need, and nothing extraneous that would ultimately end up confusing the user of our class. So the first thing that we're going to do is integer object.add1, and then we're going to do it again. Okay? The next thing that we're going to do is system.out.println integer object. Now remember what I said, we don't have to directly call toString in order for this to work. System.out.println is smart enough that it will call the toString method of the object variable that you pass in automatically, and it will pull in that information and print that to the console, and we'll see that in a minute. The next thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to say integer object dot set value, and then I'm going to say integer object dot get value -2 -2000, and then I'm going to say system.out.println integer object again. So obviously the first two lines of our interaction here, obviously we add one each time. Fairly straightforward. So you guys can probably guess what's going to be printed here once we call this. This right here might be a little bit odd to you. We haven't talked about this too much. One thing to keep in mind is that Java has a very specific order of operations that it follows in order to accomplish things. And the first thing that it does is it checks to see what is inside parentheses first. So the first thing that actually gets evaluated is this right here. Because the first thing that Java tries to go through is figure out what methods need to run at the deepest level of a line of code and then actually perform those actions. And in this case, the method that gets performed is actually integer object.getValue. So it will be whatever the value is of the integer object at that time, and if our code works correctly, it will be 6174, because remember up here we added 2 to our 6172 value. The next thing that will happen is Java will subtract 2. That will bring us back to 6172. And the next thing that will happen is it will subtract 2000. I don't know why I broke this out like this. Bear with me. And then what happens after all of this has been evaluated, Java will take the number that it results in and call setValue and change the value of our integer object to be that value. Okay? And then what we'll do is we'll print it again. So let's compile our code, and we'll go into BlueJ, and we'll actually see that when BlueJ recognizes that a particular class makes use of another class, it will put this arrow. This is a uses relationship. This says that main uses my integer. And that's something to keep in mind. This whole idea of use will pop up as you move along in Java programming. There is another side to this called isA that we will get into in the third class. But for the moment, just know that this is a uses relationship. This is a has a relationship where main has a my integer that it is making use of in order for it to function. So if we right click on our main and we click void main string args and we click through to OK, what we will see is we'll see two prints. The first one is that 6174, which we expected, and then remember the next thing that we do is we subtract 2002 from the value that I have highlighted now, which obviously would produce 4172. Fairly straightforward. Now, one thing that I'd like to show you guys is that if I create another my integer object, let's say we call it some other integer object, and we set it equal to a completely different value, let's say 42, okay, and we say system.out.println some other integer object. Keep losing my train of thought. There we go. And we compile again. Get no syntax errors, and we'll click on class 8 stuff, and we'll void main string args, and then we'll run the program again. You can see that even though we created another integer object, it is independent of everything else going on with the other integer object. So I can pick this up, and I can move it up here, and create them both in the same spot, right next to each other, and then run this again, and we'll notice that 42 stays constant all the time. That is because objects are their own things. They do not interact with each other unless you make them. So our modifications to integer object do not affect some other integer object. And that's something to keep in mind, because some beginner programmers sort of try to mush together the fact that objects are technically the same thing and that they must have to interact with each other automatically in some way, but they don't. They are from the same template, but they are their own unique element in your program. They do not interact with each other unless you actually program them to interact with each other. So that's another thing to keep in mind when you're going through this and tinkering with how you create your classes and objects. That being said, the next thing that we're going to talk about is oh, I brain farted. Oh, the assignment for this week. It'll be a little bit different format. I'm I'm changing it up a little bit for this because I have a particular objective that I want to see you guys complete. And this week's assignment will be a required completion before you can actually do next week's assignment, which will build off of this one. So I'm going to stop the video, we'll start a new one, and that's what we'll talk about next.